passengers get on board a flight that is destined to crash. Only a handful of people out of more than 100 survive this terrifying event, and their perspective on life is forever altered. Eric is one of them. After the crash, near the flaming plane and a burning pine tree, he treads a beach with a petrified face. He's still in shock, and only an explosion of enormous magnitude can shake him out of this condition. That night, Claire, a grief counselor, is woken up. She arrives at the hospital shortly after and meets with Perry, the man who leads these kinds of situations. He thanks Claire for answering the call so quickly and tells her that she should handle the entire group of survivors. Thus far, this is the biggest job that Claire has ever taken. She's been focused on her studies, but the studies never end, and Perry thinks it's time for Claire to start putting her knowledge into practice. In the end, he adds that one of the survivors will most likely need a special kind of treatment because he is in an unusually cheerful mood. Moving forward, Claire begins searching for his person. She tries to ask around, but everybody seems to ignore her. No one has time for additional questions. So after a short look around, she sees a naked man through the cream-colored curtains and decides it must be him. When she enters, we see that it's Eric, and he truly is in a magnificent mood. As usual, Claire introduces herself as a therapist and urges him to attend group sessions. Eric's answer to this is short. He is not in a position to attend any of the meetings of that kind. Then Claire offers him individual sessions, and Eric cannot help but agree. This entire time, he's been eyeing Claire with dreamy eyes. He even shoots some compliments in her direction, and states that surviving a plane crash definitely makes him eligible for a house call. His intention is obvious, but Claire needs to stay in touch with him, so she makes an appointment. The meeting ends in an extremely weird tone. Eric gets interested if she has a sister, and then he urges her to give her a call. Something bad might happen to her, and he doesn't want Claire to hold regret for not reaching out. Claire is speechless. That night, even though Eric's words might have been a simple joke from a manic patient, Claire calls her sister, Emma, and leaves her a message. From the way she speaks, it is obvious that the two siblings do not often speak to each other. Eric is woken up by a terrible nightmare the next morning. Even though he hides it well, the recollections of the plane's crash seem to haunt him. He sees an exploding engine and stands up, swimming in sweat. In the next scene, Claire tries to come up with one common script for the traumatic event. She needs to gather all of the survivors' recollections and determine what really happened. The recollection of the survivors seems to be extremely inconsistent, though. Dean, for example, seems to remember lights going off for an instant, and an explosion during the flight, while others deny that firmly. Shannon says that she remembers looking around at all the frightened faces and feeling pity for them, while she herself didn't really care about her own demise. However, after Dean's recollection is spoken out, she fights back and says that there was no warning, no explosion, until they hit the ground. She, as well as Jack, stress strongly that the crash was sudden. Here, Claire decides to address this incoherency. How on earth would Shannon have time to look around and see people in panic if the crash was that sudden? Shannon becomes defensive after this question, so there is no real point in opposing her. This is why Claire turns to Dean again, the person who seems the most honest. But before she can continue the session, she suddenly notices a man standing in the bushes outside, eyeing them with an attentive stare. The session is abruptly stopped as Claire stands up and steps towards the window, but the man disappears right away. In the next scene, Claire has a conversation with a representative of the airline, named Arkin. She tries to understand his point of view on the subject. She also wants to find out more about the possible explosion on board during the flight. Arkin seems to deny any possibility of an explosion either. He also looks extremely uncomfortable during the conversation. It is obvious that something a little unusual is going on. But Claire doesn't want too much attention directed at herself, so she finishes the dialogue in a friendly tone. Before moving away, she sees some files connected to the crash in Arkin's bag. Now she knows for sure that not all the details of the crash have been shared with her. Later that day, she visits Eric for a session. The latter seems to have forgotten all about the appointment, but he still invites her inside and offers her a cup of coffee. A wide smile is stretched across his face, and as always, he shows himself as having an extremely cheerful spirit. Initially, he wants to address one issue. He's not her patient, and their meeting is strictly casual. He then does something that Claire finds peculiar. He puts some coffee in front of her, with cream and sugar. This is just how Claire likes her coffee, but there is no way Eric knew about her preferences beforehand. Nevertheless, she shakes these thoughts off and begins asking him some questions. Soon she realizes that Eric is in no mood to participate in a therapeutic process, so she decides to yield for a while and play Eric's game. Having that done, Eric now expresses how his life changed after the accident. He used to be a broker before, working in his home office in front of expensive gear, but now he realizes that his life prior to the crash was extremely hollow, lacking any meaningful human interactions. Catching Eric in a relatively vulnerable spot, Claire puts on her therapist identity again and states how important it is for Eric to revisit the traumatic event. But Eric answers that the only thing he remembers is wind in his face and a slow walk on the beach near a burning tree. Finally, Claire asks him about his dreams, and Eric confidently makes a joke out of this question. He admits to having no nightmares, but we already know that this is a lie. Therefore, his assertion that all of his trauma recollection is gone loses credibility too. We can't be sure that he's telling the truth. In the next scene, Claire is doing research on close call experiences and the effect they have on people. She reads something unusual that she later shares with Perry, namely that people, after going through a life-threatening situation, sometimes might develop an extrasensory perception. Somehow, Eric knew she had a sister, and he also knew how she liked her coffee. There must be some kind of scientific explanation for this peculiar pattern. This explanation, however, is completely unreasonable for Perry. The same thing would be to say that Eric can read other people's minds now that he went through a serious trauma, and Claire can do nothing but agree. Later, she shares some details of her investigation, to which Perry urges her to stop immediately. She is not a detective. Claire partially agrees with this statement, but she acknowledges the importance of knowing the truth and the healing process too. Truth heals, and for the sake of her patients, she is determined to find out what really happened. Only 3 people attend the next therapy session. 2 of them remember nothing special prior to the crash, and the other one doesn't recall anything at all. Peculiarly enough, Dean, the person who proposed the possibility of an explosion on board, suddenly stopped coming to meetings. Both during and after the session, Shannon remains hostile towards Claire. She openly expresses her negative attitudes, so in the end, Claire has to postpone addressing many important subjects. Just before she sits inside her car that night, Norman, one of her patients who was unusually silent today, appears out of nowhere and dashes inside Claire's car, urging her to get inside as quickly as possible too. Claire is confused. Unable to determine which way to go, she stands in one place for a while as Norman tries to convince her to trust him. Claire feels danger in all corners of the environment around her, and the only safe space seems to be her car. Norman, too, looks like a genuine man, so she follows his lead. Norman tells her where to go until finally, he points to a man we saw before, standing frozen and staring unnaturally. This is why Norman was too afraid to go home on his own. He's sure that the man is a representative of the airline, and Dean, who openly accused the corporation, had to be taken care of by them. Bit by bit, Norman starts to remember the explosion on board prior to the tragedy, and he's more and more convinced that Dean was right. And he's paranoid, he might be next in line to disappear or to be taken care of. The memory he holds is too dangerous for the corporation. Claire knows that after a major traumatic event, paranoid feelings are normal, so she tries to convince him otherwise, but Norman's distress stays the same. Finally, he exits her car without saying anything. That night, Claire tries to get in touch with Emma for the second time. Now, as she leaves the message to her, we find out more about their relationship. A major conflict must have broken out between the siblings in the past that destroyed their relationship completely. Now, however, Claire is ready to forget about their past grudges and become friends again. The next day, she visits Eric without a heads up. She finds him painting his walls. He has no idea where he is going with it, and he wants Claire to take part too. Perhaps he even sees a great opportunity for an intimate moment. He manages to convince her in the end, gives her a brush, takes her hand, and brushes it against the wall. Claire continues on her own, and the two begin painting until a dog starts barking outside. After the accident, Eric has been waking up to this annoying barking, and it's been driving him nuts. He has no idea what is wrong with the animal, or why it barks exactly in front of his house. He becomes visibly anxious now, almost scaring Claire, but his anxiousness dissipates quickly. Instead, a calm smile is stretched across his face as he tells Claire that she seems a little depressed to him. For a while, Eric is the one donning the suit of a psychologist, even to a point that turns Claire into a skeptic, but this doesn't go on for long. The dog starts barking again, and Eric dashes out of the house to meet it face to face. Clary runs after him, and this is what she sees. Slowly and sternly, Eric approaches a white dog with serene milk blue eyes. The sight of the dog seems to half petrify him, and the sight of Eric seems to quiet the dog. All of this is happening in the middle of the road, and a car suddenly appears that has to slam on the brakes in order not to hit Eric. Then the man does something extremely unusual. As if he were in a state of altered consciousness, he slowly touches the hood of the vehicle before moving out of the way. Shortly after, he and Claire have a brief sit-down at a cafe, where Claire shares her perspective on the healing process. She says that children who undergo trauma tend to dress it up with imaginary stories. Her job as a grief counselor for these children is to find her way into their stories and determine the truth in that unusual manner. She might need to do the same in this situation. Afterwards, Claire walks back to Eric's door, where her car is also parked, and offers to meet him again. Her intent is clearly professional, of course, but out of nowhere, Eric draws up the keys to his house and hands them to her. He doesn't mean to romanticize their relationship. Claire should just have it in any case. Here, Claire agrees to take it, but chooses to come up with some rules before moving forward. The terms are simple, of course, their relationship is strictly professional. She will guide him through the process of freeing some of his repressed feelings, and Eric will stop coming to her. That night, Claire realizes she left some of her laundry in the dryer downstairs and goes to take it back. There, she sees one of her neighbors, named Tony, a woman with a sweet, smiley face. However, her smile almost never fades, and as a consequence, she has a strangely illuminated personality, one that makes you want to back away. She shoots compliment after compliment towards Claire and sees a key in her hands. After this, the conversation takes a sudden turn. They start speaking about Eric, and Tony encourages Claire to forget all about her professional ethics and seize the moment before it is too late. Life's too short, and she wants a girl like Claire to spread her wings and embrace all of it. Claire wakes up in the middle of the night. Somebody is pounding on her door. Quickly, she shakes her dreams off and opens up. It's Eric standing in the doorway, returning Claire's bag, which she left at his place by accident. He wants to be invited inside, but his night's adventure meets its untimely end here. Claire is eager to follow the rules that she herself came up with. When she closes the door and prepares herself to have some wine, somebody knocks on her door again. She thinks it's Eric, continuing to stubbornly fight for his adventure, but after opening the door she sees Tony, telling her that Eric is very handsome. She must have been spying on them from somewhere. During the group therapy session the next day, Norman's seat is empty. Yet another one of Claire's patients has disappeared, and the other ones have started to become a little anxious too. Even Shannon starts to express her fear when Arkin, the airline representative, arrives in the building. Claire decides to confront him now. His presence has a terrible influence on the healing process of her patients. During the conversation, Arkin openly states that he's very interested in what the patients remember. He even goes as far as to give Claire a warning, since the survivors are extremely vulnerable, and their memory is easily altered. Claire must not feed them her own interpretations and ideas about the tragic event. With this, the airline representative openly shows his unfriendliness and reveals himself as Claire's enemy. His purpose is to scare her away, but Claire won't be intimidated like this. She tells him to stay away and returns to her patients. Later that day, she visits Eric and sees him standing on the top of the building. At first, she thinks the worst and begs him to get away from the edge, but soon she realizes how calm Eric is. He clearly has no intention to hurt himself. He only wants Claire to join him up there. Because of her fear of heights, the latter is extremely hesitant, but she still decides to ascend the stairs to the roof. Slowly and anxiously, she gets on top of the building, and once she sits on a chair beside Eric, her anxiety gradually fades away. Here, Eric shares some intimate details from his life. It seems that he almost got married once. The fear of responsibility was the main reason why he bailed out 2 days before the ceremony. Now he wants Claire to share some of her history too, but the latter still chooses to keep her intimate life somehow under shadow. Eric then changes the subject and expresses just how he feels after the accident. It is as if he was reborn, or given one more chance to live a fulfilling life. The fact that he gets to sit here with Claire is fantastic. After saying this, he decides to play with Claire a little. Now that a deep emotional tone is set, he stands up and goes towards the edge. Claire screams from terror and jumps up as she watches how Eric disappears out of view. But running towards the edge, she sees him standing on perfectly solid ground just a couple of feet below, laughing at her reaction and his own wit. That night, they both get on Eric's bike and ride to the small port nearby. They get on one of the boats and start preparing for a nice swim inside the bay. Claire is a little anxious as she is not so sure about Eric's sailing skills, but her anxiety doubles when she realizes that this is not his boat. He doesn't even own one, and now they are about to commit the crime of taking someone else's vessel into the bay. In the middle of the calm waters, Eric tries to kiss her, not realizing that being alone with her in a romantic setting doesn't automatically mean they are together. Wholeheartedly, he laughs and goes towards the edge of the boat. He wants to go for a swim now. Claire sees this as an attempt to feel alive on his part, but it doesn't interfere. Soon, Eric jumps into the water and stays under the surface for quite some time. Time passes, and Claire becomes more and more afraid. The bugs stop coming, and she takes off her coat to save him. Once she splashes inside the freezing water, however, she sees Eric's calm, smiley face. He's extremely satisfied to see her jumping down from the boat with her clothes on, just to save his life. But Claire, on the other hand, is annoyed. She tries to deny it and get back up, but Eric begs her to stay a while. The water is not that cold. And so, in this manner, while floating in the middle of the bay, they get closer and closer to each other until their lips touch. And this time, Claire doesn't bother to stop it. Going back to Eric's house, the two end up being in bed. Time passes, and Claire decides to do something she avoided doing that day when the two of them were sitting on the roof. She opens up to him and tells him about her sister and their relationship. She tells him about the conflict they had. Perhaps because of this conversation, the next morning, holding a large bouquet, she visits her sister's house. She rings the bell and knocks on the door, but the house seems to be empty. In the end, Claire leaves the flowers by the door and turns back. It is after taking a few steps back towards her car, however, that she freezes in one place. Arkin, the dreary man from the airlines, is standing nearby, clearly spying on her. He lets her know that he knows about her affair with Eric, her own patient, and now he also knows that someone important to her resides at this address. All Claire wants is to fight him now, but unfortunately she is in a losing situation. That day, Claire calls Perry and asks for a meeting. She tells him everything. 2 of her patients have disappeared. Arkin, the airline representative, is spying on her, and another man, supposedly from the airlines too, is clearly following her patients. Claire is paranoid, and she doesn't want to hide anything from Perry, so she tells him about her unethical relationship with Eric too. Perry doesn't think the patients are missing. The fact that they are not attending the sessions doesn't mean that they've disappeared, and he is extremely disappointed with Claire. Meanwhile, Eric is doing something unusual with his wall. He used to use only paint as a decoration, but now we see some pieces of plastic glued to the wall. The final form of the piece is yet unknown, and the current layout doesn't tell us much. Later that day, Claire goes to Norman's address. She wants to check if he's truly disappeared, or just too lazy to come to the meetings. The door of the house is left flung open. She knocks on it a couple of times, calls for Norman, and after a few seconds of silence, enters the house. The place is completely empty, and there are some pieces of paper laying untidily on the table. Norman clearly seems to have made his own research about the airline. There is not much more for Claire to see here, so she exits through the door and goes towards her car. Suddenly, she sees the man who has been following Norman running from across the street in her direction. Quickly, she gets into her car, and as the man hugs her car and begs her not to drive away, she starts the engine and hits the gas pedal. The man continues to plow. He begs for help desperately, and seeing his figure in the mirror, Clary realizes that he is no threat, so she turns the car around and approaches the person, halfway rolling down the window. Here, she gets to learn a lot about this man. He seems to be one of the victims of the crash, and he has lost almost all of his memory. He doesn't remember about his identity or his life. The only thing he can recall is an explosion during the flight. He's been walking the streets afterwards, trying to catch familiar faces. One of those faces was Norman's, but the latter avoided him at all costs. He hasn't spoken to anyone about anything so far. Claire gets out of her car here and asks if she can go with him. While driving, she calls Perry and leaves him a message. She wants to talk with him immediately. That night, Eric sneaks inside the restricted territory of the plane wreck. He slowly enters the remnants of the plane when he starts to relive the traumatic experience in its full capacity. Soon his endurance breaks, and breathing heavily, he steps out of the wreck. A man is walking towards him. Creeping slowly in his direction, the latter says nothing, and it seems that for a moment Eric recognizes his character. But finally, he moves away and leaves the site. In the next scene, Claire walks up to Mr. Arkin decisively and calls him out. The man who remembers the explosion is standing behind her back. For a moment, as Claire openly accuses him of missing patients and the entire tragedy, this man remains quiet. But in the middle of the heated interaction, he speaks up, telling Arkin that he knows he recognizes him. All he wants is to remember. And so he walks up to Arkin, begging for help. He has to regain his lost memory, but as a crowd of people gather around, Arkin aggressively steps away. And all watch as Claire threatens Arkin, screaming that this man remembers an explosion during the flight. But suddenly, Claire pays attention to the faces looking at her and realizes that nobody believes her. These are the faces of pity and disbelief. They must all think she's crazy. And most importantly, she notices that the man she's pointing to has vanished. Has she been pointing to the air this whole time? The only person who attends the therapy session in the next scene is Shannon. Claire hasn't arrived yet, so she's the only one sitting in the dimly lit room. Suddenly, she sees the faces of 2 people staring at her from the bushes. A tide of immeasurable terror hits her out of nowhere, and reactively, she tries to get away as far as possible. Near the exit, Claire meets her up front and tries to calm her down. They both see somebody running towards them then, and in an attempt to escape, both run towards the exit. But soon, Claire realizes that it's Eric. The 3 of them end up in Claire's car shortly after, and we learn why Eric decided to come to the therapy session that evening. He remembers it now, the explosion. An engine blew up right next to his window. We learn a lot about Shannon as she spends that night with Claire and Eric. She's an orphan, living with a heavy load of loathing towards her parents for the entire duration of her life. She used to always think that she was left alone, but now she's ready to forgive them. In the next scene, Claire and Eric are sleeping on a couch when the latter is suddenly woken up by the sound of a barking dog. Terrified, he stands up and goes towards the main door, where the white animal is visible behind the semi-transparent glass. Unexpectedly, Eric kneels. Then, a tide of remembrance is visible in his expressions as he takes a good look at it, and he says in surprise that this is his dog. And what he says next is particularly chilling. He says that this dog is supposed to be deceased. He passed when Eric was 6 years old, and is supposed to be buried in his mother's backyard. A thought comes to him then, and he expresses something that particularly troubles Claire. He says that he must have not survived the crash. The dog disappears from behind the door, and Claire begins helping Eric in this critical situation. She says that he's here with her right now, that he's alive, and that all of this is real. This must be some neighbor's dog, but Eric isn't convinced. He walks outside and runs in search of the animal. After chasing him for a good while, Claire ends up facing a railway. Eric is standing on one of the tracks, facing a coming train. Clearly, he has decided to test his mortality. And Claire screams and begs for him to move away, but the coming train passes right through him. Eric is completely unharmed. He turns to Claire in the end and tells her to stay away from him. He demands that he be left alone. Claire returns home without him. When she arrives at the door, her heart stops for a moment. The door is left open, and Shannon is nowhere to be found. Her neighbor, Tony, comes inside the open door and informs her that her guest left with 2 other people a few minutes ago. But she must be fine. Eric will be fine, too. These last words deserve Claire's particular attention. Tony shouldn't know Eric's name. Claire never told her that. And so, now she knows that not only Shannon is in danger, but Tony is also somehow involved in all this. She leaves her apartment right away and goes to talk to Perry. The latter starts taking on his usual role in this situation. After listening to Claire attentively as she goes on and on about the unquestionable dark scheme, he tries to convince her otherwise, but suddenly he quits his act, and it gradually becomes obvious to Claire that Perry, too, is involved in the disappearance of her patients. And so, in the middle of the heated war, Claire is left without any allies. She leaves Perry's home, and only then do we see Tony at his side, seeing Claire off with eyes full of pity. Claire goes to her sister's house then, and sees that the flowers she left are still untouched. She rests in a rocking chair for a while and dozes off in daydreams, when suddenly the voice of Arkin puts her out of her condition. The voice says that all the passengers are deceased. Nobody survived the crash, and all of it was the pilot's fault. He was going through a divorce, and he wasn't even in the cockpit when the tragedy happened. The plane was in the hands of the co-pilot. Claire fights back as usual, but as Arkin turns around and steps away, he mutters almost incomprehensibly that it was him. And we understand that he's the pilot who was supposed to be in the cockpit to save the passengers, and he blames himself for the lives of the victims. He leaves his handbag behind. And as he disappears into the shadows, Claire finds the list of passengers inside. Anxiously, she reads it quickly and falls into a state of panic after seeing her own name inside. She screams for help and pounds on her sister's door in terror, but her voice is heard by nobody. The next morning, she walks up to Eric at a harbor. She tells him about the list and embraces him firmly. She realizes that Eric had known all along, but decided not to be the one to tell her. Slowly, scene after scene, Claire remembers it all now, how she met Eric on the plane, and how they found a rare connection in such a short period of time. Eric tells her now that people will come to help her in this seemingly dire situation. They will try to guide her through this process. He knows this because he saw his grandfather at the site of the crash earlier. He couldn't even recognize him then. His dog came to him too. They were all trying to help him. In this light, Claire sees some people differently. She remembers that Tony used to be her aunt, who passed away, and Perry used to be a guide in a museum who was friends with her when she was little. They both came to help her and to keep her company during the toughest part of her life. The flight turned out to be fatal for every passenger. Dean, Norman, Shannon, they all found their peace and moved on to the next part of their existence. This is the reason why they stopped coming to therapy sessions. We spectate the last minutes of their lives. As it seems, Claire is the first to notice the burning engine. The plane starts shaking, and everyone explodes in panic. Claire is petrified from shock, but Eric shows strong control over his emotions. He's the one giving her a breathing aid, and he ends up being the one guiding her throughout the final seconds of her life. She screams the name of her sister, Emma, and wishes nothing more than to be able to talk to her now. And despite the immeasurable fear of the unknown and the terrifying sense of nearing the end, thanks to this brave man, she finds herself hopeful for the future. She doesn't know it yet, but soon she will reconnect with this person, and after coming to terms with her mortality, they will together sail towards a new life.